Hello everyone and welcome back to Panik Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. I should have never come here. It's strange how quickly one's perception can change. The house, once an eerie inheritance from a relative I barely knew, seemed like nothing more than a crumbling relic of the past. A curiosity, at worst. But the moment I crossed its threshold, something shifted. A chill crawled up my spine, and I began to sense something dark and suffocating in the air, something I couldn't name. The locals had warned me, of course. They spoke in hushed voices about the house, about its history. Stay away, they urged. It's cursed. No one ever comes back from there the same. I smiled and nodded, dismissing their warnings with a polite laugh. What harm could a decrepit house do? I was young, independent, and skeptical. But as I wandered through the decaying halls, something about the place gripped me. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of something unspeakable. It beckoned me, like a puzzle waiting to be solved, daring me to uncover its secrets. That's how I found the door, hidden behind a veil of dust and forgotten memories. It stood there, half concealed, as if it had been waiting for me to discover it. And despite every warning my mind screamed at me, I couldn't resist. I opened it. And that's when everything went wrong. At first, I didn't realize what I had walked into. The room was small, cluttered with old, forgotten remnants, broken furniture, torn wallpaper, and something that looked like an old, decaying rug on the floor. But the strangest part was the walls. They were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the plaster. They weren't painted or drawn. They looked like they had been carved with something sharp, as if someone, or something, had tried to communicate through the walls, to warn whoever came next. I ran my fingers over the markings, feeling the roughness of the etchings. The air in the room felt thick, as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with something unseen. The darkness seemed to grow heavier with each breath, like the room was swallowing me whole. Then it happened. A sharp, searing pain shot through my leg, as though something had struck me from below. My body jerked with the shock, and I stumbled backward, losing my balance and crashing to the floor. My heart raced. What was it? A rat? Something hidden beneath the floorboards? I tried to move, tried to stand, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs were paralyzed, frozen in place. Panic set in, my chest tightening as I struggled to move. My limbs were locked, like I was bound in some invisible trap, unable to break free. Looking down, my blood ran cold. A massive black widow spider had crawled up my leg, its glossy black body gleaming in the dim light. Its red hourglass shimmered with ominous intensity, marking it as a predator, a symbol of death. The creature's cold legs brushed against my skin, sending waves of nausea and terror through my entire body. I tried to shake it off, but my arms wouldn't move. My body was like a stone, unyielding, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. And then I saw more. At first, they were just little movements in the shadows, smaller spiders, skittering across the floor. But they quickly grew in number, filling the space around me, climbing over the walls, the ceiling, and, oh God, *** on me ***. More black widows, their bodies glowing in the dark, their eyes gleaming with an almost predatory hunger. I could feel their legs crawl over my skin, like a million tiny, icy needles pricking at me from every angle. I screamed, but my voice was trapped inside my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The paralysis was unbearable. I felt as though my own skin was betraying me, my body completely out of my control. The larger spiders, Those deadly black widows crawled slowly, methodically up my arms, their weight unbearable. I felt their fangs press against my skin, their venom seeping through my veins. The sharp burning sensation spread across my body, gnawing away at my thoughts. It wasn't just pain anymore, it was an all-consuming fire that seemed to be burning me from the inside out. I tried to scream again, to thrash, to do anything, but all I could manage was a faint whimper. The house, it was closing in around me. The walls seemed to shift, groaning like some ancient beast awakening from a long slumber. The spiders weren't the only threat. They were just the messengers, the harbingers of something far worse. I realized with horror that the markings on the walls, those strange symbols, weren't just random. They were a ritual. A warning. And now, I was part of it. The spiders weren't just feeding on me. No. They were preparing me. The venom was a slow, creeping thing, infiltrating my bloodstream and dulling my senses. I could feel the darkness closing in, not just around me physically but in my mind. My thoughts were becoming blurry, distorted. The room was spinning, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Everything felt as though it was slipping away. A whisper broke through the haze. Soft, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. A voice, ancient and dry, rasping through the darkness. Asterisk, you are not the first. Asterisk. I tried to focus, to understand, but the words made my head spin. The spiders, their presence suffocating, filled every inch of the room now. I couldn't see clearly anymore, the venom had blurred my vision, but I could feel them crawling all over me, their cold bodies like weights pushing me down. My breaths were shallow, desperate. I realized then that the house was alive. The walls, the floors, the very air, they were all part of it. The spiders were only the first step in the house's ritual, a means to break down those who entered. A warning. A call. The house had claimed me. I had become part of its web. I wanted to scream. To fight. To run. But my body wouldn't respond. My limbs were no longer mine. They had been claimed, consumed by the venom, by the dark magic that permeated the very foundation of this place. You will never leave, the voice whispered again, this time clearer, almost satisfied. I could feel my body growing weaker, my thoughts slipping further into the abyss. I was being absorbed, slowly becoming part of the house's twisted history, a name among the forgotten. Those who had come before me, their faces and names lost to time, were now trapped within these walls. Trapped just like me. And as my consciousness faded, I realized the truth, the house was never abandoned. It had been waiting. Waiting for the next victim to fall into its grasp. And now, it had me. It was only a matter of time before someone else would find this place, drawn to its darkness, to its secrets. And when they did, they too would be claimed. Just like I was. The darkness closed in, and I felt my consciousness begin to slip away completely. My vision blurred to nothing but a haze of blackness, and my body felt like it was no longer my own. My mind screamed, fighting to stay alert, but it was a futile effort. I was sinking, slowly fading into a kind of numbness, where even the pain no longer had any meaning. The whispers in the walls had grown louder, the voices of those who came before me now mixing with my own thoughts. They were speaking through me, their voices cold and hollow, empty echoes of lost souls trapped in the same torment. I could hear them, feel them, pulsing in the air, around me, and in the very fibers of my being. The spiders kept crawling, their tiny legs scraping over my skin, their presence relentless. They were no longer the threat, they were the agents of something worse. The real horror was the house itself, the ancient force that had bound us all. The spiders were merely messengers, heralds of its hunger. As the last shred of my will faded, I realized something terrible, I was becoming part of the house. I was no longer a visitor or a victim. I was its prisoner, I could feel my body disintegrating, my thoughts unraveling as the venom consumed me from the inside out. It wasn't just my limbs that were paralyzed now. It was my soul. And then, silence. I don't know how long I was gone. Time didn't matter anymore. When I awoke, if you can call it that, I was no longer myself. I was them. The voices I had heard in the walls, the ones who had whispered of their torment, had now become mine. The dark presence of the house filled me, its power flowing through me like the venom that had once burned through my veins. I opened my eyes, or what passed for eyes in this new, dark existence, and I saw it. The markings on the walls, the symbols carved deep into the plaster, pulsing with the same eerie energy they had held before. I could feel the pulse of the house in my chest, in my very core, and I knew the truth. The house didn't just trap the living. It consumed them. It transformed them. And I was no different. I had become a part of it, just another lost soul within its endless web, waiting for the next one to come. I could hear the footsteps now. Faint, hesitant, just beyond the door. Another fool. Another victim. I tried to scream, but my voice was no longer my own. It was just a whisper among the others, carried away by the wind. The house was calling again, waiting for someone else to come, to step inside, and to meet their fate. And they would. Just as I had. Just as we all had. The web was waiting. It was just another ordinary day, or so I thought. The sun hung low in the sky as I walked through the quiet streets, the world moving around me in its usual way. Nothing seemed out of place. I'd been feeling run down lately, maybe a little too stressed. But when I got home, I never could have known that everything was about to change in ways I couldn't even comprehend. The moment I entered the apartment, a strange unease settled in, as if the air itself had thickened. My mind kept wandering back to a peculiar incident earlier that day, a faint, tingling sensation that brushed across the back of my neck as I passed through the park. I had shrugged it off at the time, thinking it was nothing. But as the evening wore on, that odd feeling returned, and I couldn't shake the suspicion that something was terribly wrong. I had no idea then that it would be the last, normal, evening of my life. What I thought was a harmless bite, just a fleeting irritation, was the first step toward an unimaginable nightmare. One that would consume me from within. It started with a strange sensation on my neck, like a faint sting, barely noticeable but enough to make me pause for a moment. I rubbed the spot instinctively, trying to dismiss it. I was tired, overworked, maybe just imagining things. But when I looked in the mirror later that evening, there it was, a small, puncture mark, like a tiny red crescent embedded in my skin. I frowned, thinking it could have been a bug bite. A mosquito or something else. Nothing to worry about. But as the hours dragged on, the discomfort turned into something more unsettling. I sat on the couch, trying to unwind, but the room felt wrong. The air was too thick, and the shadows in the corners seemed to flicker and stretch. It wasn't the kind of shadow you get from a light being turned on or off. No, this was something else, alive, almost. I tried to ignore it. I blamed it on the late hour, fatigue settling deep in my bones. But then I heard it, soft, barely audible, like whispers, coming from nowhere. I froze. My heart began to race, but the voices weren't words, just a strange, humming hum in the air. I looked around the room, eyes darting, but I couldn't find the source. I even checked the windows, but they were locked. There was no one else here. The whispers didn't stop. They curled through the air like smoke, creeping up the walls and curling into my ears. I could feel them, their presence. They were here, watching. But I couldn't see them, only hear the faint, almost imperceptible hum, growing louder with each passing moment. My pulse quickened, a shiver running down my spine. By the time I made it to bed, my neck throbbed. The bite mark was now darker, spreading out in an angry red circle around it. It burned, almost as if something were crawling just beneath my skin. My pulse raced, my mind unable to make sense of what was happening to me. Maybe I was just getting sick. That's all. Maybe the stress had taken a toll. But then the air in the room grew colder. Too cold. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices merging into something almost recognizable. They no longer sounded like an accident or a trick of the mind. They knew me. They spoke to me. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. My breath came faster, panic flooding my body. I clutched my throat, desperately trying to calm myself, but I could feel it. The poison. The venom that was working its way through my veins. The bite on my neck wasn't just a mark, it was the beginning of something far worse. The sensation crawled beneath my skin like thousands of tiny legs, the poison traveling deeper with every second. The shadows in the room grew longer, stretching toward me, curling like fingers reaching for my soul. I was paralyzed, unable to move, only able to watch as they inched closer, their forms twisting and shifting. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, and they knew me. I reached out to turn on the bedside lamp, desperate for any kind of light, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My limbs felt heavy, as if invisible chains held me in place. The shadows swarmed around the room, their voices now clear in my ears, whispering promises of mercy if I only obeyed them, if I only let them take me. The words didn't make sense, yet they were all I could hear, all I could feel. Suddenly, I felt it, a cold touch on the back of my neck. Sharp. I froze. It wasn't the chill from the room. This was something else. Something that came from within. I managed to twist my head, my breath shallow and ragged, to see the mark on my neck. It was growing, expanding outward, becoming darker, more pronounced. It looked like a black spiderweb now, intricate and terrifying. My skin burned, and I felt my heart pound in my chest, but worse than that, something was crawling beneath my skin, moving with unnatural speed. That's when I realized. The bite wasn't just a bite. It wasn't just a venomous mark from a black widow. It was a curse. A claim. The creature that had bitten me wasn't done with me. It had only begun. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak beneath me, but the poison had already taken hold. My mind raced, trying to think, to plan, to escape, but the room closed in around me. The whispers intensified, now more insistent, like voices inside my head. They wanted something, something I could never give. I felt it, that cold, calculating presence, crawling beneath my skin, making its way through my veins, controlling me, turning me into something else. A puppet. A victim. The shadows twisted and beckoned, urging me to follow them. I tried to fight it, to scream, but my mouth felt numb, like a mask of ice had taken hold of me. I turned to the mirror. My reflection was almost unrecognizable. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale, like death had already touched me. And the bite, it was no longer just a mark. It was an entrance. It was no longer a sign of injury, it was a doorway to something dark, something ancient and terrible. A presence that had always been there, waiting. Watching. Then, I saw it. A black widow, crawling slowly across the floor toward me. Its legs were long and spindly, its body glossy and dark. Its eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence as it moved closer. Its gaze met mine, and for the first time, I understood what it wanted. The poison wasn't just in my body, it was in my soul. The bite hadn't just been a warning. It had been the start of a slow, suffocating process. The spider had claimed me, body and mind. And now, I was no longer just a victim. I had become a vessel, a host, to something far older, far darker, than I had ever imagined. And as I collapsed to the floor, my body succumbing to the poison, I realized that I would never be free. The Black Widow's kiss wasn't just the end, it was the beginning. The beginning of my descent into darkness, where I would never escape. I would be lost forever. The darkness swallowed me whole. As the venom continued its relentless journey through my veins, I felt the last remnants of my control slip away. My body, once mine, was no longer under my command. It jerked and trembled with every passing moment as the poison spread further. The shadows seemed to pulse, living things that crept along my skin, digging into my bones, their presence more real than anything I'd ever known. I tried to scream again, but my voice was just a rasp, barely more than a whisper. The room, no, the world, faded around me. The edges of my vision blurred as the spider's grip tightened, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still breathing or if I had already passed into something else. Then, in the corner of my mind, something stirred. A dark, whispering voice, so familiar now, slithered through my thoughts, claiming me entirely. It was the voice of the Black Widow, but not just the creature that had bitten me. It was the presence that had been lurking inside me from the very start, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. The bite, it wasn't just an entry point, it had opened me up. The venom, the poison, had connected me to something far older, something from the dark corners of the earth. It wasn't just the spider's influence I felt now, it was its will, its desire for me to join the shadows, to become one of them. I had no choice. My body was no longer mine to command. It moved without my will, responding to an ancient pull, a primal instinct. I rose to my feet, or what was left of me. My hands, now trembling and blackened, reached out, finding the walls of the room, my movements awkward, unnatural. The whispers had become a chorus now, countless voices, all speaking in a language that wasn't meant for human ears. The shadows grew thick, crowding around me, their cold tendrils wrapping around my limbs, holding me close. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was part of them, part of something bigger, something worse. The Black Widow was no longer just a creature in the dark. It was me. It had consumed me. As I walked, glided, toward the door, my reflection in the mirror didn't look like me anymore. It was a twisted version of myself, eyes cold and empty, face drawn and pale, but with the unmistakable flicker of the Black Widow's influence behind them. I was no longer a human. I was an extension of the darkness, a puppet bound to the will of the poison that had coursed through me, mind and body. And so, I left the apartment. The night was thick with shadows, the streets empty, as though the world itself held its breath, knowing what had been unleashed. The Black Widow's kiss had turned me into a thing of the dark. And now, there was no turning back. The whispers would never stop. The shadows would never release me. I was lost to them. Forever. It seemed like the perfect idea at first, a weekend getaway in the family cabin. No distractions, no deadlines, just a chance to reconnect. We'd all been so busy with life, work, school, relationships, that the idea of escaping to the woods felt like the perfect reset. The cabin, old and rustic, stood nestled between towering pines, with a warm hearth and a lake that reflected the vast, endless sky. It was exactly what we needed. The first night was blissfully quiet. We laughed, reminisced, and shared stories long into the evening. The air was cool, the smell of pine and earth fresh in our lungs. It felt safe, protected, even. Like nothing could go wrong. But when I woke up the next morning, everything had changed. The silence felt wrong, suffocating. The warm, welcoming cabin had transformed into something else entirely, something I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I couldn't remember how I'd fallen asleep. My mind was foggy, as though I'd been drugged, but the last thing I remembered clearly was the sound of my younger cousin telling a ghost story by the fire. I must have drifted off after that. But now, I lay in bed, the covers tangled around me, a strange, wet sensation against my skin. I tried to move my arms to pull them free, but something was wrong. My limbs felt heavy, too heavy. I couldn't lift them. I shifted my gaze, panicking. The room was dim, the only light coming from the slivers of daylight peeking through the shutters. It looked different. The corners seemed to have darkened, the air thicker than it should be. I tried to sit up, but it felt as though something was pressing down on me. My body refused to respond, and panic surged through me. I struggled harder, but every attempt made the weight on me feel more suffocating, like the very bed was pulling me into it. And then I saw it. A tiny, wriggling creature crawling across my arm. A spider. My heart lurched as I swiped at it, but when my hand connected, there was no relief. The spider didn't scurry away. It simply stayed there. I blinked, confused, as it remained motionless, its black legs twitching ever so slightly, as if observing me. A soft buzzing filled my ears. And then, as though it had been waiting for that moment, I felt something sharp prick my skin, a small, pinching bite. I yelped, but the sound was muffled, almost drowned by the strange humming around me. I looked down, horrified to see more spiders, their glossy bodies gliding across my skin. There were so many, now. They crawled up my legs, scurried across my chest, and some even wriggled under my clothing, making my skin crawl as they found new places to bite. The feeling of dozens of tiny legs scraping against me was maddening. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was tight, my voice strangled by whatever had taken hold of me. Every muscle in my body felt leaden, unwilling to obey. The pain of the bites, the sharp, burning sensation, spread through my veins, hot and invasive. Then, the worst of it hit me. The walls were moving. Not in the way they should, settling under the weight of time, but in a slow, undulating rhythm. The wood of the cabin seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing. The air itself felt wrong. My mind raced to make sense of it. The spiders, they're everywhere, but why are the walls alive? It wasn't just the spiders. I turned my head, desperate to see something familiar, something human, but there was nothing comforting left. My younger sister, Emily, was lying in the corner of the room, her body motionless. A thin layer of sweat covered her skin, her breathing shallow, but I could still see the telltale marks of the spider bites on her arms, on her neck. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them, no trace of the Emily I knew. Her pupils were wide, unblinking, as if she were staring into the abyss. And then, that grinned star. It wasn't hers. The smile stretched too wide, too far, until it was grotesque, far beyond the limits of the human face. I could feel my stomach twist, but I couldn't look away. The spiders continued to crawl on me, in me, their bite becoming more insistent with every passing second. And then, her body moved. Just a small shift, a twitch of her fingers, and a low rasp escaped her throat. "You should have left." The voice was hers, but it sounded wrong. Like something else was speaking through her. Her lips didn't move the way they should, her throat giving off a series of unnatural clicks and hisses. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch. I tried to scream again. This time, the sound was barely more than a whimper. It felt as if something was sealing my mouth shut, as if my body was being consumed from the inside. A horrible realization crawled into my mind. This wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just spiders. My family, they were changing. I blinked, struggling to clear the fog that clouded my mind. The sharp buzzing in my ears intensified as I tried to gather my thoughts. There were more of them. My mother, my father, they were all here, and they were no longer themselves. I managed to turn my head slowly, the effort feeling like it might break my neck. In the far corner of the room, my mother was crouched on all fours, her body contorted in ways that were far too unnatural. Her legs bent at odd angles, and her arms, no, legs, scrambled across the floor, dragging her closer to me with an unnatural speed. Her face was twisted, stretched in the same way as Emily's, that sickening, empty grin spread too wide for any human to form. Her eyes, empty, vacant, stared at me, but I knew she wasn't my mother anymore. Not entirely. Not after what had happened to her. My father was no better. He lay against the wall, his body twitching erratically, his chest rising and falling in spasms, as though he were struggling to breathe. But there was no humanity left in him. His eyes darted around the room, but they didn't see anything. They were glassy, lost, and the spiders, they were in him too. "Join us." The voice echoed, more than one of them speaking as one, that same sickly, inhuman rasp that made my skin crawl. The words were a whisper in the darkness, and I knew that they weren't just asking. They were demanding. I struggled, desperate to escape, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt my muscles begin to tremble as I realized with horror what they were asking of me. They didn't just want me to join them in this cursed existence. They wanted me to become one of them. To let the transformation consume me, to lose myself entirely in whatever vile, twisted thing they had become. The walls seemed to close in. The spiders crawled over me in waves, their tiny legs digging into my skin as if they were inside of me. The ache in my body grew unbearable, and I knew then, this was the beginning. The transformation had already started. My family, the people I loved, the people I trusted, they were lost. And now, they were coming for me. It was too late to run. And all I could do was wait for the darkness to take me, too. The cabin was silent once more. The forest outside, once so vibrant with the sounds of birds and wind, had fallen completely still. The spiders no longer crawled, and the movement of the walls had ceased. There was only the faint echo of whispers, as though they were still there. Watching. Waiting. But no one was left to answer them. The cabin stood as it always had, a place that once offered safety and warmth, now a prison of shadows and hunger. The reunion was over. And the family, what remained of it, had become something else entirely. Something not of this world. And it would never leave. I woke up with a sense of unease, a feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. The remnants of strange dreams clung to me like cobwebs, vague and elusive, fading the moment I tried to remember them. My mind felt foggy, as though I hadn't rested at all, but I couldn't deny the heavy exhaustion in my limbs. As I blinked the sleep from my eyes, the sunlight streamed in through the window, harsh and unforgiving. But there was something different in the air, something off. I lay there for a moment, trying to shake the weight in my chest, wondering why my heart beat so erratically. The world around me seemed a little too quiet, as though the morning had forgotten to begin. Eventually, I pushed myself up, the familiar motions of my routine barely registering. The dull throb of my head guided me toward the bathroom, where I hoped a splash of cold water would wake me up. That's when I saw it. A small, black spot near the edge of the sink. It shouldn't have caught my attention, dirt, dust, something easily ignored, but as I leaned in to examine it, my breath hitched. It was a spider. A black widow, its glossy body gleaming in the weak light. Its legs splayed out in delicate symmetry, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The sight of it, too still, too perfect, made my stomach turn. But what truly unsettled me were its eyes. Black, empty, fixed on mine, unmoving. It wasn't just a spider. It was watching me. I snapped out of my trance and backed away slowly, trying not to breathe too loudly, as if the simple act of making a sound would provoke it. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I suddenly felt dizzy, as though the air in the room had thickened. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was just a spider, right? One of nature's quiet little predators, nothing more. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something terribly wrong. I quickly left the bathroom and made my way down the hallway, thinking I could shake off the creeping unease. The cool air from the open window in the living room did nothing to calm me. I noticed the silence again. The usual hum of the world outside, the birds, the distant sound of traffic, was absent. The world felt muffled, like I was walking through a dream. A movement caught my eye at the edge of the room, and I froze. A black widow, smaller than the one in the bathroom, clung to the wall. I stared at it, its glossy body almost blending into the shadows, but its eyes, those damn eyes, were locked onto me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were trying to communicate something, something terrible. Panic surged through me. It wasn't just one. It wasn't even just two. No matter where I went, the spiders followed. Each time I looked away and then back, there was another. In the kitchen, there were three, sitting on the counter, their black bodies gleaming like jewels in the dim light. I jumped back, stumbling into the corner, but they didn't move. They just waited, their legs twitching slightly, their eyes glinting in unison as though they were aware of me. I didn't know what was worse, the spiders or the growing sense that something else was behind it all. The spiders felt like the tip of something far darker, something watching from the shadows, something pulling the strings. I felt a crawling sensation on my skin, as though invisible threads were wrapping around me, tightening, slowly. My breath was shallow, and every movement seemed to echo louder than before, as if the world had suddenly grown too small, too tight. I bolted from the kitchen and ran toward the back door, desperate to escape, but just as I touched the handle, I froze again. A black widow sat on the doorframe, its body motionless, but its eyes, those eyes burned into mine. The door, once an escape, now felt like a trap. I backed away, my pulse racing, my hands slick with sweat. As I turned to run to the front of the house, I heard it, footsteps. A soft, slow sound, barely noticeable against the quiet. It was coming from behind me. My stomach turned over. I wasn't alone. I whirled around, but there was nothing there, only the shadows in the hallway. Yet I could still hear the footsteps, now accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like something was dragging along the floor. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the hallway, half hidden in the darkness, a figure moved. It was tall, shrouded in shadow, but there was no mistaking it. The figure was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong, too long, too thin. And it moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. I could see the faint outline of its face in the dim light, but its features were distorted, hidden in darkness. Its eyes, cold, empty, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. The spiders, too, seemed to recognize it. They crawled toward it, lining up in neat rows as if bowing to the figure. I didn't know whether to run or stay still. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the figure, the spiders, and the air around me were all conspiring to hold me in place. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and as it did, a cold wave of dread washed over me. It wasn't the spiders that I should fear. They were only the messengers. This thing, this creature, was the true threat. It was behind everything, the webs, the spiders, the oppressive silence. It had been watching me, waiting for me to stumble into its grasp. I stumbled back, and for a brief moment, I thought I could still escape. But as I turned to run, I found the hallway blocked. More spiders, more black widows, their bodies covering every inch of the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They were everywhere. No matter which way I looked, they were there, their eyes gleaming in the dark. And then, in the midst of the silence, I heard it, a soft whisper, like the rustling of 1,000 voices speaking at once. Asterisk, you're mine. Asterisk. The cold air wrapped around me like a shroud, suffocating me, pulling me closer to the creature that watched from the shadows. My vision blurred, and my limbs felt weak. I knew, then, that there was no escaping. The spiders weren't the real threat. They were just the harbingers of something much worse. I was caught in its web now, and there was no way out. I fought against the crushing feeling in my chest, my lungs tightening as if the air itself was being squeezed from my body. Every step I tried to take felt like I was moving through molasses, heavy and slow. The spiders, their tiny legs scraping against the walls and floor, grew louder in my ears, more numerous, more insistent. They weren't just in the house anymore. I could feel them outside, too, just beyond the walls, beyond the windows. Waiting. Watching. The figure in the hallway stepped forward once more, its shadow stretching out like a darkened omen, swallowing the room. Its hollow eyes fixed on me, its presence seeping into my very bones. The spiders gathered at its feet, forming a perfect circle around it as if they were offering themselves to it, submitting to its will. You were always meant to be here, the voice whispered again, but now it felt as if the words were coming from everywhere, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. It was not just the creature's voice. It was the spiders, too. Their movements seemed to echo the same words, their skittering forming an unholy chant. You're mine. All of you. I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against the wall, but there was no escape. The weight of it all, of the creature, the spiders, the suffocating silence, pressed down on me. I closed my eyes, desperate to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but when I opened them again, nothing had changed. The creature was closer now, its form more defined in the dim light, yet its features remained shrouded in darkness. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like the weight of centuries had settled upon me. I felt it in my soul, in every fiber of my being, a predatory hunger that had been stalking me, waiting for this moment. A flash of pain shot through my head as something cold and sharp grazed my skin. I looked down. One of the spiders had crawled onto my arm, its fangs glistening as it sank into my flesh. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just the bite. It was the sense of something else, something ancient, beginning to crawl inside me. The world began to spin, my vision narrowing, and I felt the energy drain from my body. The spiders were no longer just creatures, they were part of this thing. It had woven its webs through my life, through my very existence, and now it was taking me. I wanted to scream, but the sound didn't come. I tried to move, to escape, but my limbs wouldn't obey. My body grew colder, weaker, as if the life was being pulled from me, piece by piece. Then, everything went still. The darkness deepened. The last thing I felt was the cold touch of countless legs skittering across my skin, the weight of them pressing down on me like a shroud, and the overwhelming sense of being swallowed whole by the darkness that had always been waiting, just beneath the surface. And I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that I would never escape. I was tangled in the web now. My life was just another thread in its design. And as the darkness closed in, I understood. The spiders were only the beginning. The creature in the shadows, the true force behind it all, had claimed me. I was part of its web, trapped for eternity. The whispers echoed in my mind as my consciousness faded. Asterisk, you're mine. Forever. Asterisk. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, one of those rare moments when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, and all was still. I had long ago grown used to the solitude, the quiet nights after his death. My husband's absence had hollowed out the house, but I tried to fill the emptiness with mundane routines, trying to convince myself that I was fine. That I could live without him. But in the deepest parts of my mind, I knew something had changed. The house was not the same without him. It wasn't just the silence that had settled over every room, but something darker. Something uninvited. I could feel it crawling in the corners of my thoughts. It started small. A strange smell in the air when the wind blew too strongly. A flicker of shadow in the hallway when I was sure no one else was there. But I ignored it. After all, grief can play tricks on the mind, can't it? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. And then, the night I was bitten. I woke to the sound of scratching, quiet at first, like a whisper against the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, tried to pull the covers over my head and drown it out, but the noise persisted, growing louder, sharper, like nails scraping against wood. It seemed to be coming from beneath the bed. My heart raced, thudding in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. Maybe it was just a rat or something else small and insignificant. But this wasn't like any noise I'd heard before. It was deliberate. Methodical. I threw back the covers and swung my feet to the floor, my toes grazing the cool wood of the bedroom. The silence that followed was suffocating, and for a moment, I thought perhaps it had all been my imagination. But then it came again. A sharp, scraping sound. Closer this time. With trembling hands, I grabbed the bedside lamp and flicked it on, casting a faint yellow glow across the room. My pulse quickened. Everything seemed still, too still. The room looked unchanged, too normal. Yet I knew something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. A black widow spider, emerging slowly from the shadows beneath the bed. It was bigger than any spider I'd ever seen, its black body gleaming under the lamp's light. Its legs moved with a chilling, unnatural grace. But this wasn't just any spider. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. This was something more. The way it moved. The way it watched me. It was calculating. It was waiting. I froze, my mind racing as the terror set in. It wasn't just the size of the creature or the fact that it had somehow appeared in my bedroom in the dead of night. It was something far worse, the memory of that night, months ago, when I had been bitten by something far smaller, far more innocent looking. But that bite had done something to me. It had begun the transformation. The pain had been unbearable. The venom that coursed through my veins had burned like fire, like acid eating away at my insides. But death had not come as I had expected. Instead, my body had changed. I felt different. My skin became too tight, my joints stiffened, my vision blurred, and the house around me seemed to pulse with some unholy life. I had barely survived that night. And now, here it was again, the creature that had started it all. The Black Widow stopped at the foot of the bed, its 8 eyes gleaming like dark jewels in the dim light. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, caught between the terror of what I had once experienced and the reality of what was happening now. I could feel it, the venom. It was spreading through the air, seeping into the very fabric of the room. I watched in horror as the walls began to shift. The paint bubbled like it was melting, pooling together in strange, twisting patterns. The floorboards creaked, not with age, but with something alive, something sentient. And then, the furniture. The once sturdy dresser began to shift, its legs growing longer and thinner like spider limbs. The wood groaned and cracked, bending in unnatural directions. The dresser split down the middle, revealing its hollowed interior, where more spiders, hundreds of them, crawled and scuttled. They moved like a mass, as if controlled by some invisible force. The venom. I realized then, the venom wasn't just in the spider anymore. It was in everything. The entire house was infected. I turned my gaze back to the widow. It had grown larger, its body swelling, its legs stretching out as it crawled closer, each movement faster, more erratic. I could feel it, the same cold, suffocating sensation I had felt when I was bitten. The transformation had begun again, this time more forcefully, more violently. My skin felt tight, my muscles aching as if they were being pulled in different directions. My heart raced as I fought to control it, but I knew deep down that it was futile. The spider stopped right in front of me, its eyes locking onto mine with a deadly, knowing gaze. It was not just an animal. It was a force of nature. Suddenly, the floor beneath me buckled, and I fell, crashing to the ground. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I could feel the change now, the poison seeping into my very bones, warping me, twisting my humanity into something else. My hands, no, my legs, felt wrong. The once familiar shape of my body began to shift and contort, and I could feel my joints moving, shifting into angles they shouldn't. My skin thickened, darkened, becoming as hard and glossy as the Black Widow's body. The house around me continued to warp. The furniture, the walls, the very air, it was all alive, all changing, just like me. I could feel the venom spreading throughout my body, crawling through my veins like liquid fire, taking root in every cell. And then, I understood. The widow's bite had not been an accident. It had been a curse that had bound me to the darkness, to the vengeance it carried. The widow was not just a spider. It was vengeance incarnate. The poison, the change, the transformation, it was all part of its plan. A plan that had started the night of the bite and was now coming to fruition. I had been marked. And as the last of my human thoughts slipped away, I felt the urge to crawl. To hide in the shadows. To scuttle along the walls, just like the creature that had come to claim me. I was no longer human. I was no longer alone. The widow's revenge had been completed. And now, it was me. The world around me grew darker, the shadows deeper, as my final vestiges of humanity faded. The transformation was complete. My limbs, once fragile and human, now moved with the uncanny grace of the spider. I could feel the hunger, the instinct to hide in the corners, to blend with the night. The house, too, had become something else, twisted, warped by the venom that coursed through every crack, every crevice. It was alive now, just like me. The walls seemed to pulse, their surface shifting like the skin of some monstrous creature, the floor beneath me soft and spongy, as if it too had been swallowed by the poison. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of transformation, and in that oppressive stillness, I knew that I was not just a victim of the widow's revenge. I was part of it. I felt the pulse of the house around me, the way the rooms seemed to breathe with an alien rhythm. The spiders that had once crawled in the dark corners of my home were now everywhere, their eyes glistening in the murk. I was surrounded by them, my brethren. They had come, summoned by the venom, by the curse. And in the distance, I could hear it, just a whisper at first, but growing louder. A voice, no longer familiar, but one I once knew well. "Welcome home," it whispered, a voice that echoed through the warped walls. It was my husband's voice, but distorted, twisted. He was gone, yet somehow, he was here. Asterisk, "I've been waiting for you." Asterisk. A wave of cold dread washed over me. Was this my punishment? Or had I finally become one with the curse, lost in the endless cycle of vengeance? It didn't matter. I was no longer a widow. No longer a victim. I was the monster now. And the house, this nightmare, was my new home. The spiders were all around me, their many legs skittering across the walls, the floor, and even me. And I, the widow's new creation, stood tall among them. I was the darkness now. I was the vengeance. I was no longer a woman at all. I had become the thing I once feared. The widow's revenge had claimed me. And there would be no escape. The house would never be still again.